Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome cinematographer Christian Springer, ASC, who joins us to talk about their work on Widow's Bay. Christian will talk us through his work on episodes 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, and 10 of the show. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Christian. Hi, Christian. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Pleasure.
We're here to talk about Widow's Bay, which is currently out on Apple TV Plus. And before we jump into the project, how have you found the reception to the show?
Yeah, very warm. Unexpectedly so. I think when we were making the show, I think we kind of had this feeling that there was a good chance that no one would really understand the tone or would be on board with the sort of, I think comedy and horror mashups tend to not do too well critically. And so we were, I think, maybe a little convinced that it was gonna be like a very specific type of audience would appreciate it, and most people would kind of cast it off. So it's surprising to see such a positive response. It's great.
Yeah, I think as like a show, it was something that was on my radar mainly because I like Matthew Reese and the people behind it, and I just
Yeah,
thought, yeah, cool, this is something that's going to be something that I want to keep an eye out. And then yeah, it came out and I was like, wow, this is not what I expected in a way. I thought there'd be more of a comedic element to it,
mm,
but it was also, but yeah, it feels like it leans more towards the horror side, but I think the comedy is more just the way that people are playing it straight in the whole situation of what's
yeah,
going on.
yeah.
And yeah, it's quite a delight really.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we had that idea when we were putting the show together, or as we were making the show. We kind of started to realize that like the trick was like anytime there was like a big joke in the script or a big joke that came out through performance or whatever on set, we sort of realized that we wanted to like kind of push it down and almost de-emphasize the joke part. And then, this obviously the comedy, the horror moments, we sort of wanted to extend out and really let that be the contrast to the comedy. But yeah, I think we started to realize that like it was funnier if it wasn't broadcasting itself as straight comedy.
Yeah, and I think as well, like I was thinking about this earlier, like regarding like the whole look of the show and also the feel of it, because I was reading somewhere else, like because it's not the way it's shot, it doesn't feel like a spooky sort of show, and it doesn't. You kind of allow it to be more just. I want just like like the feel of it is just that you're telling these people stories, and it's their town, and their town just seems to be a bit odd and a bit
Yeah.
off. And I always think like there's not many like horror comedies. I think the first one that popped in my head was like Eddie Murphy's Haunted House. I don't know if you ever seen that.
I have
And
not.
and I was like, well, that pretty much takes place pretty much all at night. So, but this takes place between night and day. And I guess because you
Yeah,
don't, you know, I guess the true horrors can happen whenever. And I think we see
yeah,
that in episode 3 with in the swimming scene, which is creepy. I don't know if I ever want to go back to the beach again. After watching that, I think we traumatized like a whole new generation of people, just like Jaws did.
yeah. I think Hiro Murai, who is one of the creators of the show and directed half of it. Um, we talked a lot about, I think obviously the show is referencing films of the past and horror of the past. It's not necessarily referencing like modern horror. There's a lot of kind of nostalgia horror, if you will, that we're sort of referencing. And with that, we talked a lot about like Jaws is a great example. We talked a lot about like The Shining. The Shining is ultimately like pretty bright, and like a lot of it takes place during the day. Like the first half of the movie is like, there are spooky moments, but it's not like extremely high contrast and extremely underlit and lots of, hard, dark shadows and, jump scares. It's a very like, it's almost like sort of a mundane, normal looking environment that then through like tension and playing with the audience's like anticipation and discomfort, like that's where a lot of the horror moments come from. And I think obviously Jaws is a great example too. Like a lot of the first half of Jaws is like takes place in bright, sunny, New England beaches, and yet it's still like terrifying. And we liked the idea that like there's not that much horror these days that is done that way. A lot of horror now has to be like stylistically very strong and have almost like guiding the audience into being scared. And we sort of like the idea of like not just like inherently baking in an aesthetic that is going to clue the audience in as to how to think. And I think because it is part horror, part comedy, I think the audience is kind of left a little unsure of like when they should be afraid or when they should be laughing. And there are these like funny moments of levity in these that cut through these moments of tension that I think all good cinema does. Um, and yeah, I think part of the game of the show is like really trying to lean in hard to playing with that contrast. We keep saying like it was almost like the conceit of the show was almost like the tone was supposed to be the razor's edge between horror and comedy. Like the tone was that very thin little line dividing the two.
I can imagine as well, like when you're having those initial meetings, that like you can have these conversations and say how the look and feel goes. Then once you're on set with the performances, you probably think like might need to tweak some of this just a little bit and play around a bit more with how it looks and it feels. And I think as well, like having a place where you're stuck on an island and it's a character in itself probably plays a big part in how you want to frame things and use the geography as well, of the island, because you have that mix of visitors and then mainlanders and then natives, and how you can sort of play around with those ideas. And I think you see that a little bit in episode 4 with the cocktail party,
Mhm. Mhm.
and how like people are used to the island, but actually there's something else going on, and how you can kind of, yeah, use the geography to move people from one location to another without them realizing.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was a certain, I mean, like you're saying, in concept, it made a lot of sense to us, but in execution, we never shot on an actual island. We did shoot some aerial units and some second units up in some islands off of the coast of Maine, but for the most part, everything was sort of shot a little north of Salem. All of our, island exteriors, if you will, north in this peninsula called Queen Anne. And then a lot of our interior island, like non-coastal islands, were shot several hours in west of there. And so there was sort of like, this whole concept that we came up with of like how the island fits together and what the makeup of what the visual aesthetic of the island is, and what the island, what the map of the island is and all that stuff. And then then in production, it really became like, how do we actually glue the island together? How do we marry, this gas station that's, an hour 15 west of Metro Boston with a, town exterior that's, an hour and a half north of Boston. And, it becomes like almost like designing the puzzle pieces, and then you're left with like a million puzzle pieces and figuring out how to put the puzzle together.
Yeah, like, I guess as well, you have to think about the continuity side of things,
Right.
in terms of like, well, if this is the street out, how are we going to shoot that when they turn up, for example? But then also if they exit the building, but then we're just in another location, it's like, script supervisor, you need to make sure that they, you tell them on the day that they turn right, not left, and
Exactly, exactly.
little things like that. But then also it's like the lighting side of things, because even it'll be like a match cut of how it's going to look. And I'm sure you and your team are completely all over it, but it's just, I can imagine like there's pressure a little bit and stress, because if you're shooting that scene on day 3, but then come to day 8, you're doing the match cut. You've already lost, there's already 5 days of shooting where you're thinking of other things. So you kind of need to make sure that you're, as soon as you step there, to be like, oh yeah, this is how it's going to be like. Talk to your gaffer and his team to make sure that
Yeah,
it's all
exactly.
select correctly.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that there's sort of like different production models for different types of television, and this show happened to be sold, budgeted, and sort of greenlit on the premise that it was like a half-hour comedy, right? And so a lot of half-hour comedies, they shoot like maybe 5 or 6 day episodes max, and 3 or 4 of those days you're shooting in like your standing sets, and then you go out and you shoot some like shots, in a few like practical locations, and that's sort of what's called like the quote unquote pattern for production. And hour-long episodic and like limited series dramas, they have something like Game of Thrones, they have a much more luxurious approach to production. But ultimately we tried to sort of make this show under the disguise of a half-hour comedy. So we were budgeted and sort of scheduled and prepped for, I think in some people's minds, for that sort of comedy pattern. And I think that was sort of like the biggest challenge of making the show ultimately, was there was definitely, I think some expectations that we were sort of going to be making a pretty standard half-hour comedy that, had some spooks in it. When in actuality, we had pretty tall ambitions to make some, sort of prestige level production. So yeah, there was lots of challenges associated with that.
Well, I think the one, because I spoke to Roger Fires, who is the production designer on Scrubs, on the
Mm,
latest series that's just come out. So I think they did 5 days prep and then 5 days shooting,
right.
which is again is pretty insane. But then another Apple TV show, Slow Horses, when I spoke to the director, I think he said for the 6 episodes that they shot, I think they did 200 shoot days. So then when you kind of hear like the difference between the two,
Yeah,
um, yeah, it is insane. Granted, you can't really, it's like comparing oranges to potatoes.
yeah, yeah,
It's a whole different ballpark. But if it's like for audience members to understand that, like when you're doing something like that, it's absolutely huge. But then how quick of a turnaround it must be. And you're
yeah,
mentioning that you'd be
right.
spending most of your time on the standing sets, but then also you'll have those sort of location days where there's no margin for error, which is quite scary.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We were much closer to the Scrubs model than we are the Slow Horses model in this show. Um, but to no one's fault, I think Apple was crazy enough to greenlight this show in the first place, knowing that it was incredibly ambitious. And we ultimately exceeded anyone's idea of what our ambitions might be. Um, I don't know if you've seen through the end of the series, but a season, but episode 9 and 10, there's like a huge kind of like nor'easter storm that rolls through, and we basically, very early on, Hero and I kind of, and our production designer, we sort of all made this collective decision that like we should do everything as much in camera and as much practical effects as we can. And so, that literally resulted in us with like rain towers in every single exterior scene that we did for, you know 3 weeks of production, I think, and every single extra was getting soaked, and we had the rain gear, and we had like big wind machines. I mean, it was like a pretty serious. You don't typically have that type of production value on half-hour comedy budgets and schedules. So, it required a lot of heavy lifting in all departments, in the production team and the assistant directing team. Like, it was a true labor of love for everybody involved. But that's the fun challenge of it too.
The thing is, well, like, because as I guess as a production, they always have to weigh up with how much can they do in camera and how much could you rely on VFX. But then also, if you do more in camera, it will help VFX later on because they have more to play
Yeah,
with and work with. Um,
exactly.
it's like a massive, it's a massive Rubik's cube that if you move one thing,
Yeah,
thinking that you got it correct, it could actually turn out to be wrong or somewhere else.
right,
Um,
exactly.
but then also at the same time, if you're all on the same page of like what you want to do and how much you want to do in camera, um, how do you go about planning something like that for yourself? Because if there's so much water, so much rain, you obviously need some sort of cover for your cameras. There's also you need to be all pretty much in like scuba gear so you don't get absolutely drenched as well. Also, poor extras as well, like probably like take after take, being like all wet and that. But how do you go about planning for something like that, and then plan it all so that when it comes to the day of shoot, you're not going to be stressed about it. You know exactly how the water's going to flow and where it's going to sort of end up in a way that you're
Yeah.
not going to screw it up in a way. It also, that probably comes down to special effects and getting
Yeah.
involved as well.
Yeah, we did have a very robust special effects team that was, we had a large marine team that handled anything related to boats, and anytime we shot out on the actual open water or in lakes or anything like that. And then we had a large special effects team that very dedicated and had their hands very full, because most of our boat interiors were shot on stage, and so we had to custom build like gimbals that would rock the boats back and forth on, that we built in the studio. And so that was all handled by a pretty advanced special effects team. But I think what what was really helpful ultimately was that we had a really good idea of the whole arc of what the season entailed creatively and narratively from the beginning. We didn't have all 10 scripts when we started. I think I want to say we had maybe 8 of the 10 scripts, but we were able to kind of read ahead, and then there were outlines for the scripts that we didn't have, so that we at least knew, 6 months ahead of time, okay, we're gonna have 2 episodes where we're just gonna have an enormous amount of like storm and water special effects and wind, and that gave us a lot of extra time to be planning that stuff. And also, the series was shot with by myself and then our other cinematographer Cody Jacobs. And Cody started actually working as Hero and my gaffer, starting on Atlanta season 1. So he's been our gaffer essentially for a decade. I've worked with him for almost 20 years. And so he kind of knows our playbook very well, which is naturally kind of what led us to make the decision to promote him to be the alternating cinematographer. But because of that, we kind of got the upper hand of having sort of the shorthand with him as well. So, he and myself have a shorthand, and he and Hero have a shorthand. He has a shorthand with our, sort of stylistic and production approach. So I think that was a major player in being able to plan all this stuff cohesively as a production. Because a lot of times there's a cinematographer that comes in as a guest DP, and they're working with a guest director, and they maybe have an AD that's not, on the whole production, and then you're really just like handing the reins of the show over to a bunch of strangers, and then you're trying to like spend weekends getting them up to speed. And so this was built from the ground up, knowing that we had an enormous amount of like uh challenging production work ahead of ourselves. I think Hero and I, we we do have lots and lots of discussions early on about, big picture, sort of stylistically, what we want and why. And there's there are discussions about, um there are storyboards and shot lists, and we do lots of sort of like think tank sessions where we just sort of try to figure out how we're going to solve these problems and what it is that we need. And then it's somewhat my responsibility to then like filter those wants and needs down through the various departments. And so I have lots and lots of pre-production sub meetings with special effects team, art department team. I work very closely with the AD department, to kind of communicate like, look, this is what Hero's vision is for how this works, and I want to make sure that I have this type of support, and how can we all come together for that. And when it requires a lot of different departments and they to participate in some sort of big effect or pulling something off, I think I will plan extensively with, overheads and maps, and we'll have lots of like sort of logistic based meetings, just to kind of like execute and make sure that when we show up on the day, like you said, we can't really skip a beat. Like we kind of have to have everything figured out and planned by the time we show up on set. So the goal is that when you're actually on set, you're not figuring anything out. You're just executing the plan, or at least allowing yourselves to like have a plan so that you can be flexible and play, and, play within the boundaries of what you've set up.
So first things first as well, like that you've worked for Cody for 20 years. So literally that is like, I think there should be another word for shorthand, because it probably just like,
Yeah.
you know,
We're also basically best friends at that point too.
yeah, it's like, well, yeah, it's like, well, you kind of got no choice really if you've been together for 20 years.
Yeah.
There must be, yeah. So yeah, the shorthand's out the window. It's completely like you're basically like,
Basically
uh,
kind of a hive mind at that point,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm just picturing, like pluribus with you guys on set and
Yeah.
planning. You're not even talking to one another, just like looking like,
Exactly. Exactly.
I know what you're thinking, Cody. Um, with something like that as well, like I think as audience members, you don't realize how much planning would go into certain
Yeah.
setups, and there's obviously tweaks on the day, because just maybe something just has happened that you don't know and you can't control. But as you said, like you basically want to turn up to set, be like, yeah, we're going to be shooting this. I've got the storyboards here. We've got SFX know that they have 100 liters of water that they need to dump every take, and then visual effects will amp it up a bit more. Yeah, let the sound people know that their mics might get ruined,
Yeah, yeah.
when they might keep people up. Um,
Exactly.
and so on and so forth. I think as well, like when you're across everything, part of it must be quite like, it's probably really fun, but then also there must be times when you're lying in bed, trying to get to sleep, thinking, are we going to be able to do this? Have I missed something? Is something not going to work out? Because I think sometimes you hear stories like creatives, like how could we pull something like this off? I think Alice read an article of Chris Corbould, who's a SFX supervisor here in the UK. He was at the time, like part of the article, he was talking about Skyfall and how they were going to do a scene, and then it's like, yeah, it's come to him. We're going to crash a tube train through the wall, and it's like, he's like, what a great idea, but then also it's like, well, how are we going to do it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a lot of relaxing sleep had during a production like this. But, again, I think the other thing is that like some of us have worked together for so long and have gone through so many iterations of wild, crazy things that we've pulled off, and like even the things that aren't pulled off in the way that we kind of expected them to be, like somehow turned into something even better. And so you do have to somewhat surrender yourself to random the randomness of the universe, and be welcoming unexpected challenges and just ready to, pivot and I think I would say earlier in my career, I spent a lot more time stressing out about things not going as perfectly as I, was expecting them or planning them to go. And I think ultimately, I think that stress is only useful to a point, and then it becomes, counterproductive. And so, but I think mostly that confidence comes from experience and also just working with, ultimately the same sort of like core team. Like my camera operator, my focus puller, Cody, Hero, these are people that I've worked with for, very, very long time and trust so much and know that like collectively like we'll be able to figure out any solution to any problem at some point. And I think also the other thing that's worth mentioning is that like Apple is an interesting company to be working for, because I think that Apple feels quite dedicated to quality, and I think you can see a certain level of quality with everything that they put out. And there was like a weird secret confidence in the back of my mind that like if something is terrible, we'll probably be able to fix it or redo it or pivot. And if financially that, I've worked for other studios where it's like there is never going to be another dollar given to us to fix anything. So that causes such a great deal of respect of stress. And I think that like secretly deep down, I sort of always knew like Apple seems to be like more committed to something being good and of really good quality than they are of like making sure that we come in at the perfect dollar amount on our budget. And no one like openly had that discussion with anyone, but I think that you just sort of like spiritually understand that a little bit, which was weirdly like in a roundabout way like somewhat comforting, I think, at the end of the day with all of this.
The thing is, well, like, it probably helps that Apple make most of their money from like their products, like the phones
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Macs and all that. So they're like, well, if this goes belly up, it's fine because this is like our side quest in what we want to do.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but at the
Yeah, the
same
studio
time,
is not going to go out of business if this show fails.
yeah, exactly, and they're all sort of they have that sort of fallback in a way. However, they probably still, as you said, like the idea that they kind of have that quality and know that that they're hiring the right people and knowing who they're going to get, because it's not just Hero, but it's also Katie Diplo, who is one of the creators as well. So like they will have a lot of trust to sort of greenlight
Yeah.
stuff. But I think once they start watching like the dailies and understanding what you're going for, I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled people to the side and said, here's another check for a bit of extra money if you need it, just in case. Because I've been on a show like that where I think we were week one, or I think we were like the second week of shooting, and the studio production company wrote out like a check to be like, here's a little bit extra if anything goes wrong, or if you need to like make if you want to do want to do that scene somewhere else. And it was like, oh, nice. um
Yeah, I certainly am not aware of any extra money that was given. I do know that we kind of ended up pretty actually on target with budget and schedule. We did do a little bit of reshoots and pickups, but I think that's always planned for. And I think the only like big major thing was we did slide our start date back at the last minute, because when we were gearing up to begin production, it I think Hero specifically felt like we didn't quite have enough time, and we weren't like fully ready to go. And and also we were supposed to start production on a Monday, and he basically had petitioned to Apple that we slide back and start production, I think, on a Thursday, which in production world is kind of I really prefer, because you kind of get like a couple of days to get the engines up and running, and then you get to like everyone gets to take a weekend break, and then you kind of go into your first full week. So I think there was many benefits to doing that, but that I remember that being a big thing with Apple where it was like, look, this push is going to cost like X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like, are we okay to just like immediately start the production going over budget? And I think to Apple's credit, they were totally supportive of us and our instinct that like we needed just a few more days to like have things ready. And really the first block went very well. I mean, I think we used that time very constructively. And I think, we took advantage of having just a 2-day start and then a weekend and yeah, I think it was worth it. But I can definitely attest to being working for other studios who would not be so supportive of that type of plan.
Yeah, and I think, well, as they say, when you get that iPhone money, anything's possible. But but I think as well, if you probably just lay it out next to you, explain everything
Yeah,
as Hero probably did, and you do it so eloquently and show like actually understand that like that whatever those if we have those 3 extra days, then we're going to be okay. But if you don't, then that's 3 extra days that we paid for
yeah,
that might actually be unusable. If they're unusable, then we're just going to come back and say we need to do an extra 3 days, and
yeah.
it's not going to be great.
Exactly,
So
exactly,
it's kind of like
exactly.
what decides what you want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is fascinating, that sort of side of things, and the sort of balancing act of like the politics side and the sort of conversations that people need to have and what they need to do. Yeah, it's a lot, and I don't think people realize when they watch shows, because you think of it as art, but it's like 50% art, 50%
Yeah.
suits and business.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I mean, most of the time when you're starting a new TV show, it's like you're literally starting a new company. It's like all new employees, most people don't know each other. You have like new office space. A lot of times you're moving from another, like most of us are from California, we all moved to New England and like it's like a startup mentality, where all of a sudden you get like this big dump of money to go like do something that you promised you could do and there's a huge like business aspect to it all. The art is the stuff that we've all done, since college or before, and the business side is the thing that takes a lot of experience to like learn how to do that each time.
Yeah, and I feel like even if you can take something from your previous job, there's always just something completely new that you're like not sure how we're gonna get over this hurdle, but
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
figure it out somehow. And what I'm really curious to know about as well is like is episode 2, lodging and shooting in the hotel. I really enjoyed that episode. There were so many like some really nice, great moments. But oh my gosh, the crawl space scene. Even speaking about it now gives you weird like tingling in my brain of like not even goosebumps, just like alert, need to be alert. And I feel like there was a big build up to that scene because it's been sort of planted in the way that people are talking about what's it called, like urban myths that people would say if you go to
Hmm,
this
hmm.
house, this is going to happen. And I'm sure, like when you're growing up, you've had the same. I know I've had the same when we went camping. How did you come about to that idea, and how did you want to sort of build up to the crawl space and the clown? Because I feel like it's scarier than the clown, Pennywise. Sorry. So it's like, yeah, I don't know. Just no, I don't know if I could watch that episode again.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people. I think that's I mean, I think that's one of our scariest moments of the season for sure. Uh, I think a lot of these conversations were like, how do we make something feel s- extremely scary, but like almost hinging on the edge of kind of like laughable. And we had a lot of conversations, specifically with the first 3 episodes, of like, how do we push it to right to the edge of that threshold? I think the sea hag sequence in episode 3 and her like flipping off the chair is a great example of like we we knew that that was almost like a borderline slapstick moment, uh, but we felt like we could buy ourselves that slapstick if we just built the shot sequencing, and if we just like ratcheted the tension up every possible way leading up to that moment, so people are like completely not in the headspace of about to like receive a laugh. And I think in the crawl space, it was the same thing. We kind of knew that this moment was going to be like the most intense and sort of terrifying moment, but also like his clown makeup was like objectively, if you pull the like sequence apart, like his clown makeup is like pretty silly and goofy looking, and he also is doing we like hung him from this like stunt wire chain track so that he could kind of like walk like a spider or run like a spider through that set. And we designed the set so the set got progressively tighter and smaller as the distance from the hole increased. And so when we were shooting it, we were laughing so hard because the whole like seeing him and seeing his goofy walk like seemed almost like farcical to us. And so I think once we figured that the farcical thing was the thing we had to like step on and build around, then all of the shot sequencing and all of like how to build, the whole setup to that moment then became like, okay, we have to really emphasize like, you know, the silence and like the haze in the air, and just like make everything feel like as tense as humanly possible, so that it doesn't read so farcical that we then like lose the audience. And because we would fail if the audience looks at it and it's like, that's stupid, or that's not funny or scary, it's just dumb. And so we were really like sort of studying that again, that kind of like razor's edge of like, how do you place it in the right spot? And I wish that I could take full credit for all of that, but so much of that comes from the editing and the sound design and the music that we built for that moment, and the visual effects. It was like truly, it was an entire production kind of having that like calibration conversation of like, how do we get what we're looking for and like make it terrifying, but then there's like underlining moments, the underlining feeling that it's like also kind of like ridiculous and and silly. But I think that's where the show like excels the most, or when the show excels the most, is like when it's kind of like playing in between that, because it is truly like a really hard balance to strike. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that like horror and comedy have very similar structures. There's like setup, there's payoff, there's callbacks, there's all this sort of like, the joke structure and the scare structure are very, very similar in concept. And yeah, this was, I don't know, it was us. I think Katie is such a master at comedy, and her scripts were so hilarious. And but I think in the hands of another filmmaker or another executive producer, the show could have gone much more in the farcical comedy direction. And I think Hero's involvement and the two of them collaborating, like, it really was this like marriage of these two like really interesting worlds, and these two sort of like masters of their craft.
Yeah, and I think you just see the right balance between it in that episode and other episodes, because you you build up to that friendship um, between Tom and I think his name's William.
William, yeah,
Yeah, so there's that sort of build up between them, and you think, oh, okay, cool, this is actually happening,
yeah,
and then it's just like, no, don't come in here, William. It's like shy, embarrassed, let me do my little task. Don't worry about me. It's
yeah.
like somebody's walked in on you. You haven't locked the door to the toilet, basically. That's what I kind of felt
Exactly.
like. And then it was
Yeah.
like, boom, the clown's there, and you're like, oh man, I wish I was in the toilet now, because it's like, just no, this is not for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, just yeah, as I said, my mind and my head is already just like, no, don't think about it. No, it's gonna make me feel like I might need to run up the stairs when I finish here as we go to bed.
We had a
Thanks.
friend, a fellow filmmaker, friend of Hero and I, who reached out to us and sent us this picture of his basement that has a very similar crawl space, and it's next to his washer and dryer. And he was like, "There will no longer be clean clothes in our house after watching that episode."
Yeah, look, see, traumatizing people. You know, I wonder if
That's
Apple
good.
can
That's good
pay.
cinema.
I wonder if Apple can pay for my what's it
Your
called,
therapy.
therapy. Yeah, I'll talk to Jack about that. Let's see if he can sort something out. There's also another episode I want to talk about, and that's episode 6, which is our history, which
Mm,
goes back in time. And I think what really stood out for me is because we've gone so far back, we don't need to think about like electricity and stuff like that. And it feels like I was just looking at the lighting sources with the lanterns, and at the end of this episode as well, when they're by the dock as
mm.
well. And yeah, it's like, it's a really good episode, but also like visually it's beautiful with a mix of like that modern camera movement. What were the initial talks of like because we're such sort of removed in terms of time period? Was there sort of talks that you wanted to keep it like a try not to have that modern spin on it with the camera movement, or was that always something that was an idea that was germinating?
So this episode was directed by Ty West, who is like a really incredible kind of auteur horror director. And we didn't know that Ty was going to join us until maybe a month or so before we went into production on that. But because we had these scripts, 6 or 8 months before, we had all kind of like had a lot of sort of creative discussions about specifically like globally how the show was going to be structured, and then how specifically episode 6 would tie into that. So when Hero and I did Atlanta, we did season 3 of Atlanta. There were these like standalone episodes that were not of our main characters. They just sort of were like short stories that took place kind of in the universe of the show. But they were like totally, separate stories. They were these, kind of quote unquote like ghost stories. And on that season, on those episodes, I had changed camera formats and changed lenses. I shot on a large format sensor, and we shot on different lenses. And I just had kind of pitched like, let's stylistically separate these episodes a bit, just so that there's a cue to the audience that they should be consuming them, slightly differently. And so I had a similar pitch with this episode, which is that I wanted to shoot on the Alexa 265, which is a basically IMAX sensor camera. And there were these lenses that the ASC recently introduced. That there are these rebuilt lenses from like the 1950s that shot like The Sound of Music, and there's these sort of like old 65 millimeter format lenses that no one's touched in like 40 years. And so I proposed, like, what if we use, these lenses and this camera on this episode? And my proposal was like, let's make this episode like very classical cinema. Lots of like really slow, slow coverage, and very like elegant camera moves and cranes, and like really a nod to like cinema of the past. And then also framing it for basically 1:1:43, which is IMAX's sort of square aspect ratio. And so we, everyone was kind of on board with that idea. I had proposed it to Hero and Katie, and then I basically like sat down with production and figured out all the numbers of how to do this, because it required us to, basically change our camera package, which in the middle of a production is a very difficult and sometimes expensive thing. And we had a lot of incredible support from Keslo Camera in Los Angeles and then Airy CSC in New York to pull this off and to make it fit within our half-hour comedy budget. Um, and and then Ty showed up and Ty started prepping the episode. And in our first meeting, Ty has a lot of background in, indie cinema where he has shot a lot of his work and edited a lot of his work. He's very, extremely technically proficient filmmaker. And so he was like, here's the camera I want to shoot on, here are the lenses I want to shoot on. Here are all my references. And I was like so embarrassingly having to tell him like, I'm very sorry, but we sort of already made a lot of these decisions and like we've already like cut the deals and the gear's already like shipping over here. And we can't do that. Which could have gone very south, but he's just such a great collaborator and also such a smart filmmaker. And ultimately understood that like we just the way that television works, like a lot of those things do happen before the guest director shows up. And so his big pitch was like, all right, well, I want to be very wide lenses and I want to be very close to Betty and I want to shoot the whole episode handheld. And of course, I initially was like, oh no, that's exactly what I don't want to do. And that's like completely contradicting my plan. But then, we sat down and talked about it. And I talked it through with Hero and I was like, you know what, I think this actually could be a really cool like idea or a really cool like set of rules to then like play within. And it really did like because most of Widow's Bay is not handheld. There's a couple of shots and a couple of sequences here and there that are handheld for a specific reason, but there's definitely no episode that we're just like shoot this as a handheld episode. And I think in his mind that was sort of like one more way that was going to separate this episode out. And so, when we also kind of like redesigned the look and the color grade and the approach, like you're saying, the approach with lighting was very different. And, all of this is just these sort of subconscious nods for the audience to take. And I think even the most novice, pedestrian audience, non-cinephile, will watch the season and then get to this episode and recognize that this episode has a lot of different feelings than the rest of the show. And I think the goal is that essentially you sort of want the audience to like buy into this in an almost a new way than they have been consuming 5 episodes previously. But then you still have the general like sense of the voice of the full series of Widow's Bay behind, like deep there, buried down behind it. And yeah, I think, lighting that we just basically just sort of set a whole new set of rules for ourselves, how to light, how to motivate, that we were motivating from literally candlelight and fireplaces. And we were using some modern lights, but we were trying to use, sort of like older tungsten lights when we could, and make it really feel like we were sort of referencing, something more nostalgic than what the rest of the show is sort of referencing. And I think it worked. I think, it was also just a really fun way. We shot this episode last, and so it was really fun for our whole production, especially like our wardrobe department, our makeup department, like lighting department, like everyone got to almost like change 99% of the way that they do their job on this last episode. And it was almost like doing a totally different project. But we had the luxury of like basically being able to talk about the plan for like 6 months. And we always would have meetings where it was like, and then when we do episode 6, like, oh, this will all change, or we're never gonna do that again, or we'll only be photographing it this way or whatever. And it was a fun it was like a fun luxury that we could have that amount of time to kind of like look forward to how we're gonna pull that off.
Yeah, it's really risky deciding something before the director sort of comes on board.
Yeah.
But at the
Yeah,
same
not something I
time,
would recommend doing ultimately, but at the same time, like again, because you're in this like half-hour comedy model, like there's not a lot. I think Ty got like 7 days to prep that episode. Like we had, you have to get a lot of those decisions made way early, especially when it comes down to like budget and with when you're changing a camera package, like you have to get the camera prepped. It's coming from two different states. So then you have to like fly people to prep and then they have to fly back with the gear and then you've never shot with the camera before. So you have to do tests. I mean, literally just that process alone is like 2 weeks. So a lot of times if you can't make those decisions ahead of time, you're not gonna make those decisions because you literally don't have the like bandwidth or the schedule to like pull that stuff off. So we really had to get way, way, way ahead of it.
yeah, exactly. And it's the little things like that where you need to work out how probably something like surely a camera's the same as any camera, but it's actually just more about how you're going to frame things, how is the color going to look, how is it going to play up, because we're not actually going to use we're going to try use more natural lights. There'll be less lights on set, or just going to use candle light and all these sort of little things. But then also certain people will be like, but this is episode 6, how could you shoot this so out of sequence? But I think you mentioned it as well. It's like your production design probably has to change so much, but at the same
Yeah.
time, if you let's just take out that wall, we don't need to worry about it if we take it out because this is the last episode. So
Yeah, yeah.
if anything, we're doing people a favor, but then you can just move things around a bit more and not worry so much, compared
Yeah,
to if it was like back
we
and
did
forth.
have to exactly we did have to kind of like reconceive of how the show functioned. Like the lighting package got completely like changed out. We had to clear a bunch of our sets that we knew we weren't going to be using anymore, like like Evan's bedroom and the Loftus house. Like we knew we were not going to be going back in there, so we had to like clear that out and build like a cave set. And a lot of it basically was sort of like the production was almost like halfway shutting down, and then it was almost like we were like piggybacking like a weird independent horror film on the back of this Apple series. That's what it felt like. But I think also it was also really exciting for a lot of us to get to do this kind of like Quaker era period piece after spending 6 or 7 months producing this other show. It was almost like we got to jump right into something like totally new challenges, which is fun. Really like helps keep keep crew engaged and keep you creatively kind of firing on all cylinders.
I think as well, like you probably get a little bit of like excitement because you know that you'll be doing something contemporary to then be moving to period
Yeah.
within that period as well.
Yeah, you
Um,
get to anticipate or like look forward to something, it's sort of fun. We did that on Atlanta with our standalone episodes. We shot them all at the end. And so it was almost like we wrapped the series and then we just went and did three really weird short films with the same crew, with all new cast. So, it's kind of like it's kind of a weird, fun model.
yeah, that's quite a cool way of doing stuff as well. I've got two more questions. For my penultimate question, what was your favorite scene that you didn't shoot?
That I didn't shoot. Oh boy. I would say, I mean, so much. I think that the episodes I didn't shoot were all some of my favorite scripts. I think 5 and 8 were very, very much from the beginning. I was like, oh, these are both like some of the. I think 5 is one of the funniest scripts. Just the whole like drug trip sequence, I think, is really hilarious. And then 8, the whole episode is just an incredible homage to that genre of horror film. I would say probably, I think my favorite scene, from just purely cinematography speaking, I think was probably the fire in the bonfire in episode 4. I think that was, anytime you read in a script there's a enormous fire that's lighting everything and you're going to shoot it practically in the woods at night, over in one night, you immediately start to panic because you know, A, that you're never going to get anyone to agree to build a gigantic bonfire, nor would it be safe to be working around a big giant bonfire. And Cody being, having worked the last 20 years as a gaffer, I think is such a genius when it comes to, how to build practical lighting effects, to pull that off. And I think many, many times, especially in television with television budgets and schedules, you make decisions that you are just hoping and praying that the visual effects department is going to be able to bail you out and save you. And I think anytime it's practical uh, um, elements like fire, wind, or rain, those are always, I think, the hard or ocean waves, like those are always the hardest things to convincingly do with visual effects. And Cody, I think everyone was sort of trying to talk him into why doesn't it, why can't it be just a small fire, and then we'll do it with flame bars, and then we'll hide condors and light the rest of the scene that way, which would, I think, be the kind of standard like television way to approach a lighting setup like that. And he had so much conviction and so much confidence to really lean in hard to basically building this like enormous practical lighting tower and using that to literally light the whole scene and blocking the whole scene, and Sam, the director, and him like really expertly kind of like knowing what angles were going to feel creepy and what angles were going to feel flat and frontal, and when to be in those angles as it pertains to the story. And then just having the confidence in the visual effects team that they would be able to pull it off and that it would convincingly look like real fire. And I think it's like one of the most like visually stunning sequences of the whole season. And yeah, very, very jealous that he got to do that and not me.
I think as well, like though sometimes you might think, how would I have done it? But then you two are a hive mind, so
Yeah,
it would probably been quite similar or exactly the
yeah.
same. So there's
Most
no
of the
way.
times I'm like, oh, if Cody were gaffing for me still, that's exactly how it would look.
Oh, see, exactly. So it kind of works in a weird way. And then for my final question, what was your favorite scene to shoot?
I think my favorite scene is in episode 9. There were a couple scenes in episode 9 that I really had an amazing time shooting. One was um the continuation of episode 6, which is the continuation of the flashback story, which is them out in the ocean, lost in the fog. And that was a sequence that was originally written as a night exterior, pitch black, and the lantern was basically the only thing lighting them. And when I read that sequence, I really had a tough time envisioning practically how to light and shoot an entire scene in the ocean or a water tank, that would all be lit by one lantern that wouldn't just end up looking like goofy, fake lighting. And so I had basically put a lookbook together for this pitch that I had where I went with the rest of our producers, our production designer, our special effects team, and uh and our production manager, and basically pitched like, instead of us doing this at night, why don't we build the fog up practically in a stage and build a giant water tank and shoot this as this like very murky kind of like pre-dawn moment where there is this sort of soft ambient glow everywhere, and you'll be able to actually see what's happening, and we don't have to motivate everything from a lantern. And it was a pretty big stylistic swing from what was originally written in the script, but I I successfully pitched it to everyone. Everyone was on board, and then it just came down to us calculating like how much it would cost to actually practically pull that off. But I think that sequence is so fun and effective, and came out so good, and I'm very, very pleased. It was really, really fun to shoot. But I think probably my favorite sequence of the whole season is the lighthouse sequence in episode 9. And I think logistically it was extremely complicated, and it required like 5 different nights, and like it was shot over. It was Some of it was shot on stage, some of it was shot in a parking lot, some of it was shot at an actual lighthouse, some of it was shot uh you know uh 2 hours away in an opposite direction. I mean, it was like literally the marrying of so many different moving pieces, and I'm sure cost millions of dollars for us to pull this off. But ultimately, I think what I like about it is that it was like so much unbelievable effort, and I think visually it came out really quite stunning, especially when he gets up into the lighthouse and the storm, he realizes how bad the storm is. And ultimately, the whole thing was sort of all for like this really dumb callback joke of how what a dummy the lighthouse operator is. And it was like we kept like joking while we were making it. We were like, we're spending so much money on this, just the stupidest joke, like that maybe people won't even laugh at. And we like put so much undying effort into trying to pull this off and make it as excellent as possible. I remember we had to build this one set for one shot of him like climbing the stairs up the lighthouse. And there was like 4 meetings, and the producers were just like, do we have to build this whole set for this one shot? Like, it just seems like such a waste of money. And we were like, we have to get this. It's the only way it works. And but ultimately, I think the scene is like really dramatically effective, and for those who are like keeping track, it is also just like a really funny, dumb joke. And I think that that just contributes to what the show is in a nutshell, which is like it goes to great lengths to do some like really silly stuff, and it takes itself so, so, so seriously every step of the way. And I think that just like helps that, again, that kind of like razor's edge balance of, are you supposed to like take this as a dramatic beat or a horror beat, or are you supposed to laugh at it? And you kind of don't exactly know, because the clues are kind of like misdirecting you the whole time. And yeah, I think that sequence, just from like a cinema of like reading the script, talking about how it was going to work, storyboarding it, prepping it, shooting it, executing it, and how it came out, I think that was probably my favorite sequence of the season.
Um, yes, solid choice. I think once you talk about all that sort of planning, like, oh, we spent over how much days and going all over the place. It makes me feel a bit anxiety for like the continuity side of things, but then also like producers like, we not just do this in one place.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah. No, there was every producer meeting we had was like, can we just do this with visual effects? Like, do we have to do this practically? Like every single meeting, and every meeting we are like, yes, we have to do it practically. We're sorry, but it has to be done this way. But I think that's also what feels fun about the show when you watch it, and it is kind of what separates the show a little bit, is that like you can really feel, especially right now in this like era of like, we're about to get, or we're already getting flooded with just like AI slop and things that are just, generated with prompts. And I think feeling the like human ingenuity and the amount of like manpower it takes to do something practically, I think is going to increasingly become more artistically valued in entertainment. I think that, people like Chris Nolan are like capitalizing off of that concept right now. And I do think that like if you can pull that off in television, let alone on half-hour comedy television, it's something that's pretty unique.
100%. And I think that's a very good way to end the episode. Christian, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you. This is
Yep.
great.
Widow's Bay is streaming now on Apple TV Plus. Go out and watch Christian and his team's amazing work. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you.
You take care, and bye bye now.
All right. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.